governance, architecture theory, social aspects. So this is it's great to have Jim here. I know Jim from activism before architecture. We were both involved in peace activism and Palestine support. And he went on, I think, to co-found Academics for Palestine. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Correct, yeah.
And we've also been involved in housing research. Jim does, in his work in Bolton Street, he's involved in housing research, housing provision, housing procurement research, housing research generally. We've shared references in the past. When I got interested in looking at crits, he told me about Jeremy Till. And when he got interested in this, I told him about Eyal Weissman. And both these people, Till and Weissman, would be examples of people, of architects who've very strongly addressed the theme of current, one of the main themes of current, which has been how can architects move beyond being instruments of capital, merely decorators of power, doing what they're told. How can architects take a critical role? And obviously, there's always a challenge when it comes to the practice per se of architecture, but certainly in terms of research, both Till and Weissman are good examples of how architecture can be used to throw light on situations from another perspective and a radical perspective. So Jim will talk more about Eyal Weissman, but he's an Israeli architect who has been analyzing the, if you like, the structure of apartheid in Palestine, looking at things like infrastructure and access to resources, even cartography and legal issues to do with boundaries. And so look, and I'm just going to leave it like that and ask Jim to give his talk. If I've left anything out, Jim, just say so.
Thanks, Mark, and really sincere thanks to you for giving me the Eyal Weissman reference. And you were the first person to mention him to me, and he's one of the people I will draw largely on today for this talk. So it's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me. And thanks to a few of my own students there, I see, so thanks for coming. I want to welcome my favorite Israeli in Ireland, Ronit Lenton. Ronit, thanks for coming along as well. Could I do a little, is it possible to do a little poll first? I just want to see how many people have had time to look at the video link that was sent, or I hope it was sent, of Eyal Weissman's Rebel Architecture piece, 25 minutes long. So can you put your hands up? Is that possible? I see one. Yeah. And thanks, Mark. Yeah, I see a few hands going up. Yeah, good. So at least 6 there, including, and then Mark. Oh, okay, good. Well, if for those who haven't, I strongly recommend it because he kind of says it so succinctly and it's very visual, and there's great. He's actually in the West Bank and in the settlements and by the wall, and he uses great graphics as well to demonstrate what's happening there. So I'm going to share my screen and start talking. I have a PowerPoint, and I'd like to do it like that so that I talk you through the PowerPoint. I'm going to read 2 bits, and I'm going to talk more, if you like, informally about other parts. Thanks again for asking me. I'm going to start with a little preamble, and I'm assuming some people at least won't know much about the Middle East, not alone Israel, Palestine, and excuse me for being presumptuous. So I'm just showing you where we're talking about, and it's this part here of the Middle East, where, like, you can see Greece there, you see Turkey, Cyprus very close. You can see the Nile Valley and the Delta. You see the Panama Canal, see Saudi Arabia here, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, okay, Lebanon. And down here, we've got Yemen in total turmoil at the moment, very sadly, in dire straits. So I'm showing you this partly because I want to just make a general comment about the Middle East. I'm reading Robert Fisk's wonderful book, and you can see that, and I put it down for a while, but the Great War for Civilization, but he talks about these Westerners who have this great interest in the Middle East in a kind of sociological or way, and he condemns it. He said it is not interesting in that way. It is totally tragic. The Middle East is totally tragic, and no place more so than Israel and Palestine. Like, so just zooming in, you're starting to see the borders there with the Negev Desert in Egypt, southern Israel, the Gaza Strip just there, West Bank, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and close up again, you see Ashkelon and Jerusalem right here in the center of Israel and the West Bank. You can almost see the boundary there of the West Bank. That's starting to take place. This is the Jordan River. So the area we're talking about is between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. There's the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. Okay, so they're the boundaries, if you like, and then this boundary on the south, and then up here just above Nazareth, where I visited, is the border with South Lebanon. And then over here is Jordan. This is Jordan. And just to give you an idea of the size, right? That's the Gaza Strip. There has a little boot on the bottom. It kicks out. I hope you can see this clearly on your screen. And that's the size of Gaza compared to Dublin, just superimposed on Dublin. And it's about, from memory, I think it's about 51K long by 9, 10, 11, 12K wide, you know, that kind of size. Okay, 2 million people, almost 2 million people living. So, and again, I want to thank Ronit, helped me with this morning. So thanks, Ronit, because I was trying to get up to date figures. It's quite hard, but the population of Israel is 9.25 million, say. And of that, roughly 20% are Palestinians. Might even be 21%. And it's broken down here. So in 2020, so it's from memory now, this is Muslim, Jewish, Christian. So these are, if you like, the Jewish Israelis. And then these are what are called Arab Israelis, Palestinians. So what I've done then, and these figures are, so they're from the virtual Jewish virtual library, thanks to Ronit. And then Wikipedia, then we got figures from the West Bank. They're over 2 million. Gaza almost 1.8. So I've kind of added these onto these figures and get total Palestinian population of over 6 million, and a total Israeli population, according to this, of almost 7 million. So I'm curious to go back and check those exactly, because I've read the various things. The other thing is, I just want to raise this in passing. It's the issue of terms, really. So I don't know if everyone knows what Zionism means. So I wanted to put it down. This is the Wikipedia definition, right? And of course, there's Semitism and there's anti-Semitism. So these terms are very important, and they're often used in inappropriate ways and wrong ways. And there's a big debate going on. It's been going on for the last few years in Britain about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I just I haven't read this article yet. I actually want to go in and read it, but the writer is arguing that it's from The Guardian. It's a long read in The Guardian. He's arguing that we should not conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism is vile. It targets Jewish people because of their religion and their ethnic origin. And I'll state my views towards the end of this towards the end of the talk on all of this. So those terms are important as well. You hear them bandied around a lot. And the other thing that's important is, and this is Zionism's dilemma in Palestine, is like Zionism is about supporting the idea of a Jewish nation and that it has its own state. And the question arises then, what are the boundaries of the state? And I've put up a series of maps here. And if you look at the first one, that's showing the area of Palestine claimed, I can just about read this, by the World Zionist Organization, and officially presented at Paris Peace Conference. That's just after the First World War. So you can see there, this is great. What these people wanted was a greater Zionist state that goes well beyond the Jordan River, well into the Negev Desert, down as far as Arish, and then well into southern Lebanon, and takes a bit of Syria as well. What's now the Golan Heights. So that's one group of Zionists. Now, there are different strands within Zionism. That's why I wanted to talk a little bit about the term. It's like good cop, bad cop, if you like. There are some who thinks Israel should stay within the Green Line, for example, and don't support the settlements, you know. So that's what these maps are about. Now, these maps down here are just surrounded, and these are put out by the various Palestinian solidarity groups, but it shows the actual, it shows Jewish land and Palestinian land in two different colors. And just in say 1946, you can see the extent of Jewish land compared to Palestinian land. And then what happened in 1947, there was the UN partition plan. And then in 1948, there was the war. Israelis would call it War of Independence. Palestinians call it the Nakba, which is catastrophe. And basically, this is what ended up here. Okay, so you got created the West Bank and Gaza, and the West Bank became part of Jordan, and Gaza became part of Egypt. And then in 1967, this is a part of history. 1967, Israel invaded the West Bank and took it over, and Gaza and the Negev Desert. It was a preemptive strike, and they have occupied these territories since then. And I'm not going to talk about Gaza today, but going to focus particularly on the West Bank. And then this is, if we scroll up then to, again, I can't see this on my screen now because people are trying to get in, but it's the Oslo Accords map and what was agreed. And unfortunately, I can't see the colors, but I think the brown is what is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And the white is what is controlled by Israel within the West Bank. So this is an official map that came out of the Oslo Accord. And you can see why many Palestinians were not at all happy with that accord. So moving on quickly, another map, I think this is the last map for now, but I just want to, and then this is from Al Jazeera, and show you the green line. So this became known as the Green Line, which is the border between Israel and Palestine, and that's it there. You can see my pointer, I hope. So just moving on, this is a map showing the Green Line versus the separation wall that's been built. Okay, so you can see a clear difference where the separation wall encroaches on much more of the West, especially up here, encroaches on much more of the West Bank than the previously agreed borders, if you like. And I just want to finish this little preamble by saying it's incredibly tragic, as I said, about the whole Middle East, but this is a shocking graph of, well, you see it yourself, you know, numbers of people killed per month in both Israel and Palestine since 2000 up to 2014. And the kind of grey color is Israelis, and the orangey color is Palestinians. And these big high ones represent the wars, but our wars of the last 10 years, 2008, so-called Operation Cast Lead, 2012 was November, and then the horrible one, 2014, where 2,500, hardly any Israelis killed, 2,500 Palestinians killed, including over 500 children. So it's an incredibly sad, tragic place. And that is produced, by the way, by a really good Israeli human rights organization called Verticality. So, and you know, in terms of building, I mean, you know, there's an awful joke one could make about this, but it's too sad to think about it. So, I'm now going to read a bit. That was my little preamble. And it's, as I said, mainly. Please excuse my presumptiveness. Maybe everyone knows lots about this area. And I'm going to talk now. I'm going to talk like Billy. It's 17 minutes past 1. And I'm going to read and show you lots of slides. So don't worry, you won't fall asleep because I've lots of slides. So what I'm talking about here is I'm trying to explore, and I'll be reading, explore the relation between architecture and town planning, immigration and settlement, and war and resistance in the context of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, the political economy of Israel, and the wider US-led war of terror. Oops, did I say war of terror? Sorry, I meant war on terror. And again, those maps again. So So political and military ideology, demography, cartography, urban planning and architecture coalesce in a process of intense spatial manipulation as part of Israel's three-dimensional control of territory in the West Bank. Urban planning, design, and the materiality of bricks and mortar become a physical manifestation of an ideological and military policy, as the benign but ubiquitous architectural typology of housing is utilized in the civilianization of a military occupation. Again, that's Weissman's term. Alice, will you tell me when I hit 10 minutes? Thanks, if you don't mind timing me. Coupled with this control and expansion within Palestinian territory is the attack on the natural demographic and urban growth of the occupied. That's a phrase of Stephen Graham's, one of the writers. Again, I'll give all these references at the end. A besieging cartography, as one writer put it, that is perceived by some as an existential threat to the Israeli state, and it must be met by a counterforce of what Stephen Graham terms herbicide, in which an inoffensive machine, the bulldozer, becomes a weapon of war and terror. The dual processes employed here of destruction and construction, of herbicide and strategic settlements, of surveillance and containment, must surely challenge any perception of urban planning and architecture as benign neutral activities, and present them instead as being deeply subservient to political and military ideology. So I'm asking you to look at architecture in a very different way than we teach it in our schools. And that's what Eil Weissman does also in his books and his work. So what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to be focusing in particular here on the period of Second Intifada. Intifada means uprising in Arabic, and that period, 2000-2005. And this notion that the brick, the materiality of building almost has a guilt associated with it. The ascent of the bulldozer, as I mentioned, destroying the symbols of the nascent Palestinian state. This notion of herbicide, spatiocide, and particularly in relation to Jenin. Again, I'll just go back. Yeah, I just want to point out the cities to you. Okay, this is Jerusalem. I mentioned, or Bethlehem is like a big suburb of Jerusalem. Hebron here in the south, but a very hugely historic city. Very important to all three religions. Jericho's there over near the Jordan River, Nablus up here, and then this is Jenin up in the north of the West Bank. So, and lastly, then I'm going to try and just make some connections with the wider context of the war on terror, as it was so called. So, I'll start with a little quote by an Israeli IDF, by the way. IDF is Israeli Defense Force, Brigadier General Ephraim Eitan. Listen to this now. We are dealing with the use of urban areas as weapon, the building as a weapon. Uncontrolled, spontaneous urbanization is a threat of war. The attacks against us are not physical, but are on the order of the system. It's an evasive threat, not conventional or terroristic. This is very important in the context of the global war on terror. So, on terrorism. So that's his quote. And that's quoted in Stephen Graham's book, which I'll show you. So basically what he's saying, buildings are weapons, and very important in the war on terror as well. So the targeting for demolition of Palestinian homes, public buildings and olive groves has been identified as a particular form of warfare waged by the Israeli Defense Force by writers such as Robert Bevan and Stephen Graham during the period of the Second Intifada. It has, however, occurred for decades and still going on. Israeli authorities give three reasons for the demolition of Palestinian homes. Firstly, bureaucratic, targets houses without planning permission, failing to acknowledge that hardly any permissions are given to Palestinians. I'll give you a quote towards the end of this. It's like crazy. Security, to create security strips along the borders or around Jewish settlements, the building of the wall or settler-only roads, etc. And collective punishment, the punitive destruction of family homes where a member is known to be involved in terrorism. Though the IDF claims that demolitions were a necessary part of the war against the terrorist infrastructure behind Palestinian suicide bombers, and then that was during the Intifada. Graham suggests that the US-led post-9/11 war on terror allowed Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister at the time, Israeli prime minister, to link Palestinian resistance to Al-Qaeda, and thus use the opportunity to destroy the urban infrastructure and cultural foundations of the proto-Palestinian state as part of a wider geopolitical strategy. He identifies three distinct areas in which the work of the humble Israeli bulldozer needs to be seen as part of the wider geopolitical strategy. Firstly, the demolitions are far from random. They're closely integrated to Eyal Weizmann's notion of the politics of verticality. Imagine a hill. Israel's 3D orchestration of territorial configurations to maintain and deepen its geopolitical advantage. That's his quote. Quoting Jad Isaac from the Applied Research Institute of Jerusalem, these sites are meticulously selected. They are for the bypass roads or new zonings for settlements to increase Israeli control. Secondly, the demolition of homes was, in Graham's words, paralleled by intensive infrastructural destruction to prevent or systematically undermine the modernization of Palestinian society. Robert Bevan has also identified the targeting of infrastructure and institutions as, quote, the systematic demolition of the nascent Palestinian state's urban infrastructure, the architectural representations of nationhood. Thirdly, Ariel Sharon's long association with the bulldozer as a weapon of war and intimidation. And here we see a cartoon of Sharon. Again, I took this from Graham's book, but it's from Counterpunch. Both Graham and Bevan quote Sharon's response when asked how he would deal with Palestinians repeatedly shooting at the Jewish settlement of Shiloh from Beit Jala. He responded, I would eliminate the first row of houses in Beit Jala. Beit Jala is another suburb of Jerusalem. I would eliminate the second row of houses in Beit Jala and so on. I know the Arabs, they are not impressed by helicopters and missiles. For them, there is nothing more important than their house. It is better to level the entire village with bulldozers, row after row. Graham goes on to argue that this herbicide by the IDF must also be seen in the context of wider demographic considerations, as evidenced through the language used by certain Israeli demographers and politicians. Firstly is the demographic time bomb of the natural growth of the Palestinian population that is seen as undermining the long-term viability of the Zionist state itself. And again, at the time when I wrote this paper some years ago, there were predictions that the Palestinians would be in the majority from the river to, from the sea, the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan. That hasn't happened according to the stats I have, but they go back to 2017, so I'm not sure. Secondly is the notion that uncontrolled Palestinian urbanization is a threat to the Israeli state, and this is a quote now, a cancer that undermines the ordered nature of the organic host body of Israel. So they see Israel as the organic host body, even though they're occupying the West Bank. These are my own pictures, by the way, from Nablus. Apart from that, that's from some book. This ideology is best represented in the words of Ephraim Aiken, who referred to the spontaneous construction of Palestinian homes as a jihad of building. Thirdly, that Palestinian urbanization, in Graham's words, strongly undermines Israel's military omnipotence and hence geopolitical power in the region, end quote. And in this scenario, the dense and unplanned nature of Palestinian cities, like you see here, are envisaged as terrorist nests, unoccupiable spaces full of the dangerous other, and the challenge to what Graham terms the panoptic, quote, the panoptic gaze of the IDF's high technology surveillance system. So what is clear from this analysis is how crucial urbanization and buildings are to Zionist colonial policy. To ensure the viability of the greater Israeli state, there is a need for both destruction and construction. The first, to clean out the unwanted other, whose very presence, public spaces, and even building typologies are seen to threaten the dominant ideology, if not the actual demographic advantage, and to create the necessary spaces for military surveillance. The second, to guarantee surveillance, security, and dominance for the occupier while looking down on the other. Israel's herbicide of Palestinian cities reached its climax as part of Operation Defensive Shield in Jenin in April 2002, where the IDF systematically carved routes externally through the dense urban fabric with bulldozers as infantry teams bored their way through while infantry teams bored their way through internal party walls of houses, a process of worming also used in historic Nablus in the same period. And this is a picture of historic Nablus showing the routes that the Israeli soldiers took. Again, you get this kind of thing. Again, these are my own pictures from Nablus. You'll see that, again, Weissman talks about that in the video, shows, and he interviews some of the Palestinian families who suffered that. After losing 13 soldiers in the battle of Jenin, this is, bulldozers proceeded to carve out an area measuring 160 by 250 meters in the city's center. According to Graham, and we have the stats there, 140 multi-family blocks were completely destroyed, and 1,500 were damaged, 4,000 people at homes, with many civilians buried alive in the rubble, along with some of the fighters. So that's Jenin. That's what was left after the that description there. Just to say then, I haven't, since I've written that, I discovered this professor here, a Palestinian professor, and he kind of expands on this issue of herbicide, and said is much more embracing that, and these are quotes, some quotes from him, that it targets the land for the purpose of rendering inevitable the voluntary transfer of the Palestinian population, primarily by targeting the space in which to live. And it is spatiocide, not herbicide. It's more holistic, incorporating sociocide, that is targeting the Palestinian society as a whole and its social ties between its members. Economicide, hindering the mobility of people and goods, and politicide, destroying the Palestinian authorities, institutions, and other embodies of national inspiration, so aspiration. Sorry. So here are some figures, again, from B'Tselem, that NGO that I mentioned. This is up to 2015 numbers in different cities and towns in West Bank. The totals there, housing units, people left homeless, minors left homeless. So I just thought I'd put them up there in different figures from 2006 up to 2015. So this was after the second, I was talking about the second intifada there, but the thing is, this is an ongoing thing, and it's got really bad in the last year. And I have I'll just go to it now. Yeah, I have a figure there for the last year, and this is from one of the Middle Eastern papers. I can't see the top there, so I can't see what it is, sorry. But they demolished 700 dwellings, making over 1,000 Palestinian homes in the last year, including 500 minors. And this kind of reached its height. It kind of made some headway here in the Irish news. It got mentioned. It was on RT, and Naomi O'Leary wrote a good piece in the Irish Times back in February 20th. And this is part of I wrote a letter about it because I was merely pointing out this is happening all the time. The only reason this is making news now is because aid donated by the Irish government has been demolished, as in solar panels. And that's the point I was making about this village here, which has been demolished, I think, ridiculous 38 times or something. These are nomadic Arabs, and they keep moving and then erecting their humble abodes. I just want to draw your attention here to the number of, the point I make in the letter is that under Israeli zoning policy, Palestinians are only allowed to build on 13% of East Jerusalem, and a startling 1% in the whole Area C. That's the area, again, we'll come back to the map and see where that is. So 94% of planning applications for building permits in Area C have been rejected in recent years. So that's probably a good reason why they just get on and build their houses. You know. So I want to end this section with just a quick reference to this notion of the war on terror. Let's go back. Slides a bit out of sync here. Any doubts about the connection between this active state terror, that's what it is, and what Graham terms the increasingly pathological Orientalist discourses? Again, I've given you some of the quotes there. Explained by dispelled by the words of IDF reservists, Colonel Buckus, one of the bulldozer operatives in Jenin. Again, this is not for the faint-hearted. Echoing Sharon's ideology and Palestinians' attitude to their homes, said afterwards in a newspaper interview, "I found joy with every house that came down. because I knew that they don't mind dying, but they care about their homes. If you knock down their house, you buried 40 or 50 people for generations. After it was finished, I begged for more work. Let me finish another house. I wanted to destroy everything, to level everything. It's not that I wanted to kill, just the houses. Believe me, we demolished too little. Quoted in Graham, that's Colonel Buckus, Israeli Colonel Yarn. So the idea of policy of whole-scale herbicide ceased in 2005, following objections both within and outside the military that was not working, but was in fact creating even fiercer resistance to the occupation. However, what some might term a low level of strategic demolitions throughout the West Bank continues to this day, showing the continued centrality and the perceived threat of Palestinian urbanization to Israel's colonization process. Several local and international NGOs legally and often physically oppose these demolitions. And here we have the Israeli Citizens Against House Demolitions, rebuilding a house for this family. What's that? That's, yeah, there's numbers of people killed in the incident. This is Rachel Corrie, of course, who was a great young American activist who sadly got killed at the hands of an Israeli bulldozer 18 years ago. And the herbicide of Palestinian cities during the Second Intifada must also be seen in the context of the war on terror, as Graham argues convincingly through his analysis of military journals. He notes the US's military belief that the road, this is a quote, the road to Baghdad lay through Jenin, unquote. That was a US military person speaking. And that, quote, US military officials were in Israel seeing what they could learn from the urban fight. That's Graham himself talking. Israeli architect Al Weissman has personal testimonies from Israeli soldiers at Jenin who described that US soldiers were there dressed in IDF fatigues, observing the herbicide. So just to conclude on this, the US military later undertook joint training exercises with the IDF in Israeli-built so-called mock Islamic cities in the Negev desert. All this cooperation soon led to what Graham terms the Palestinianization of Iraq, as the US military faced an increasingly hostile urban population, clearly not convinced of the stated good intentions of its invasion and occupation from 2003 onwards. Sorry, I'll just stay on that one. Similar tactics to the herbicide of Palestinian cities were deployed by the US military against the Iraqi insurgency, including collective punishments such as demolition of houses and olive groves by D9 bulldozers supplied by Israel. And again, I didn't get to scan this in, but you might just be able to see it. This is two images from, Stephen Graham's book, The New Military Urbanism. The top one is Palestine, and the bottom one is Iraq. And spot the difference. I'll scan it in and get it on the PowerPoint before I issue it. I jumped ahead there. We talked about that again. Bet Salim. You go onto Bet Salim's website, you see all the references to house demolitions there. So, little break now. After all that horrific, violent descriptions there of demolitions, I have a question. And I'm not going to be able to see the chat box, but I thought we'd have a little olive interlude. When I did this in UCD 4 years ago, I had olives, and everyone in the house got an olive, but sorry, I only have them for myself here. It's sadly not Palestinian; they're Moroccan from my local Arab shop. But olives play hugely part in Palestinians. Palestine's economy. Question for the students. Just based on the law of averages, say between 1967 and now, how many Palestinian olive trees have been destroyed by Israel in the last 24 hours? So you can just put your answer there in the chat box, and Alice or Mark can call it out to me. Any takers? Just on our, it's an average. This will shock you. Are there any there, Alice? Anyone coming up with figures of the 45 participants?
There's 5,100,000, 1,000, 5,000, 200.
Okay, hold on now. It's in the last 24 hours. It's not since 1960. It's in the last 24 hours. Okay, look, we need to move on. Again, a huge attack on this livelihood of Palestinians. And here you go. I'll give you the reference for this group, Visualizing Palestine. They do the most amazing graphics. And 33 times the size of Central Park have been uprooted since 1967. That's what they estimate. So that's 46 years by 365 days. So that's what I work out, is 48, an average of 48 a day. But huge, I mean, it's shocking and very, very, makes life very difficult for the Palestinians. And again, I have the link here for this group, so you can click on it when I issue the, and you can go on and there's a chat box, and this person made the comment here that 80,000 families rely on, for their livelihoods on olives. And I know Tom O'Connor, I think, my colleague, TU Dublin colleague, is here on the, and he went there and spent time picking olives last year. And yeah, so that's the figure. I mean, it's huge. 800,000 since 1967. 80,000 families depend on it. So that's my little interlude. I now want to talk about construction. It's 1340. That took me a bit longer than I thought, and I think it's best just to plow on, and then I'll leave time for questions. I'm going to speed read this bit, and I'm going to talk about these things: occupy, settle, separate, divide, colonize, conquer. These are the words that really capture what's going on, and that the architecture of the settlements are derived to satisfy all of these conditions. So I'm going to talk about urbanization and buildings as weapons of war. Again, that's how Weissman talks about them. Dwellings as optical instruments of surveillance, gaining this 3D strategic geopolitical advantage. The slow violence of architecture, again, Weissman uses that phrase. And then the notion of acceleration and impediment. Acceleration for the Israelis, they can speed through the West Bank, whereas the Palestinians are totally impeded. So I'm conscious we all have to get out by 2, so this should 10 minutes, I think I can do this in. So if the necessary and natural urbanization of Palestinian cities on their own lands are perceived as a jihad of buildings by prominent Israelis, then the process of settlements by Israeli authorities on Palestinian lands must be seen by Palestinians as a holy war through building, though only covering approximately 2% of the land area of the West Bank. You see that here on the map on the right. The settlements strewn around its hillsides, linked by high-speed exclusive bypass roads, control the entire region. A combination of separation walls and fences, observation towers, control checkpoints and gateways, exclusive roadways, control of the subterranean aquifer, and strategic placing and planning of new settlements combine to form a physical matrix of control that ensures separation and immobility for the occupied, while allowing total supervision and fluidity for the occupiers, or what Weissman calls it, acceleration, in a novel spatial experience that is both within and without, temporary yet permanent. Post-1967, Israel used photometrical land surveying with a stereoscopic camera to record and represent their newly conquered territory. Since the barren hilltops were uncultivated colonies, Israel declared them as state lands, a total of 40% of the West Bank, thus dividing Israel and Palestine across its vertical axis. Okay, remember that the hill. So Weissman talks about the politics of verticality. Again, there's some statistics there. I'm not going to go through them all again, and they're probably a bit out of date, but you see the numbers of settlers. I mean, in East Jerusalem alone, over 200,000. I'm sure it's more by now. This is interesting here, that the amount of settlers that live in 80 settlements between the Green Line and the separation wall. That's quoted in this reference here. And then Robert, and the other thing that is the proportion of building activity in the West Bank to what is actually happening in Israel is so huge. I mean, you have some stats there, you know, for 46%. Versus 1.5%, for example. There's more down there, so we can go back over that if we want to. So, total great building activity. The urban layout of the settlements is almost always concentric. The ideal of circular layouts generally compromised by topographical constraints An array of roads with services below serve repetitive lots of similarly sized red tile pitched roof houses laid out in concentric rings around the public functions on the highest level. The houses in the inner ring are often offset from those in the outer ring to ensure maximum visibility. Again, there's brilliant graphics in Weissman's piece on Al Jazeera. These are my own pictures from 2008, visiting one of the settlements. These dormitory suburbs are linked by a complex network of exclusive roadways and tunnels to the large Israeli cities. Their positioning along the West Bank hills and both their macro and micro layouts conform in general to the master plan laid out by Matityahu Drobles, who was head of the Jewish Agency's Land Settlement Division in 1978, issued the master plan for the development of settlements in Judea and Samaria. The Israelis called the West Bank Judea and Samaria. Eyal Weissman quotes them as follows: settlement through the whole land of Israel is for security and by right. Being bisected by Jewish settlements, the minority population would find it hard to create unification and territorial contiguity. You see this very clearly here, I think, in this map. And even here, you can read the blue settlements. A sentiment mirroring closely Ariel Sharon's infamous statement that we will, quote, we will cut off the West Bank like a pastrami sandwich. Pastrami sandwich. House layouts and orientation of rooms are guided by the Ministry of Construction and Housing Guidelines for new construction in the mountain region, meaning West Bank hilltops, which recommends that all living rooms face out across the landscape while bedrooms face inwards towards public spaces. You know, maybe quite unusual in a way, if we think of how we would design that you might relate to the public space. Placing and size of windows in the outward facing facade is another key aspect of the houses, but allowing the residents these panoptic viewing experience as follows. The gaze across the mythical biblical landscape of Judea and Samaria, thus gratifying religious beliefs, but also that the newly created view becomes what Weissman calls a testament to an ancient claim on the land. The comforting gaze towards the neighboring red tile settlements on the peaks across the valley, just like the occupants of Crusader castles of old. So that's from Weissman's book there. These are my picks. And then the passive surveillance of the settler-only roads and of the native Palestinian population below. In addition to the topographical positioning and the concentric urban layout of the settlements, offering what Weissman terms the newly conceived form of utopia for the settlers. The kind of airy hilltop version of the gated community without the walls. That's me. And without the walls and gates. They also afford, referring to Michel Foucault's description of Jeremy Bentley's panopticon, power through pure vision. Actual defensive walls and observation towers become unnecessary when residents, many voluntarily armed, perched high on strategic summits with 360-degree vision, can passively view the subjugated natives below, and while the latest high-tech military hardware is only a phone call or a tweet away. Both occupiers and occupied exist within the same landscape, yet encounter vastly different spatial experiences. Both compromised, though one grossly more than the other. As being both inside, outside simultaneously, trapped within what Weissman calls the politics of verticality. Now, I have a little graphic here, and this was before Weissman produced his wonderful 3D graphics, so just bear with me. This was done 8 years ago by, the graphic was actually done by one of my students at the time, Philip Roche from Sketches, sorry, Philip Ryan from Sketch Society. So we're coming now to the end. Settlers occupy the physical high ground, control the natural aquifer below, drive to and from work on exclusive highways that tunnel through ancient hills, visually relate to the other settlers on neighboring hills, and gaze from their red tile houses and manicured green lawns across a supposedly mythical pastoral landscape, but one that they can never fully experience and enjoy. But, and again, got a big quote here from Weissman. He quotes this paradox like this: the very thing that renders the landscape biblical or pastoral, its traditional in habitation and cultivation in terraces, olive orchards, stone buildings, and the presence of livestock, is produced by the Palestinians, whom the Jewish settlers came to replace. The Palestinians are there to produce the scenery and then to disappear. The panoptic arrangement the panoply of sightlines therefore serves two contradictory agendas: supervision and self-imposed scotoma. What for the state is a supervision. What for the state is a supervision mechanism that seeks to observe the Palestinians is for the settlers a window onto a pastoral landscape that seeks to erase them. Go back to my graphic. Palestinians, meanwhile, this is me talking now, meanwhile, occupy the physical lowground while experiencing a triple lock effect, being simultaneously locked in, locked out, and locked down, thrice humiliated and trapped by a physical matrix of control consisting of high walls and fences, often placed where previously stood houses and olive groves, observation towers, checkpoints, and the constant threat and occasional actuality of herbicidal journalism. A truly spatial dystopia, now purposely sliced and paralyzed, in Weissman's metaphor, his book Hollow Land, made worse by a devastated economy, occasional attacks by armed settlers, and regular forays by land and air by the world's fourth largest military machine. A dystopian space that is bisected and dissected by a 800 km long and 5 meter high concrete wall, twice the length of the Green Line between the West Bank and Israel, which weaves its way through Palestinian space, cutting people off from their work, schools, farms, relations, and neighbors. And that's the Palestinian state. So a combination of the strategic placing of the settlements, their urban planning and architecture, and the invasive containment infrastructure in the valleys below, with its open shut valves, again, that's another metaphor that Weissman uses, this idea of valves, very interesting. It also has allowed for the civilianization or domestication of the military occupation that generate what Weissman calls tactical territorial surveillance in the state's regional strategic defense plan. He elaborates thus: settlers' eyes are hijacked for the strategic and geopolitical aims of the state. The desire for a single family home has been mobilized to serve the quest for military domination, while an act of domesticity, shrouded in the cosmetic facade of red tiles and green lawns, provides territorial control. Does that mean I need to finish? The physical space of the West Bank then must be seen as a battlefield in a system of domination and control, where the manipulation of the ancient landscape through urban planning and architecture serves strategic, political, and military agenda. This is architecture and urban planning as warfare. Apart from the spatial injustices of this time, the settlements are neither economically or ecologically sustainable. They have appalling inefficient roadways, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to quote Kenneth Frampton. I'm almost at the end of this now. Kenneth Frampton says, one can observe the paradox of suburban hilltop fortresses, totally and utterly inimical to the culture of the ancient landscape. No future resolution of this concept will ever be able to heal the scar inflicted by this tragic combination of political and topographical violence. And I think I'm ending now. Lastly, the settlements and the walls are illegal under international law. And we don't talk about this enough. And I'm highlighting here different sections from the Hague Convention. So look, I have another section on that draws on Naomi Klein's chapter in her book, but we don't have time for it, and you can read it yourself and send it down. I just want to end with one quote from Weissman. I might just go back to one of the images there. And I'll finish here. He said, writing back in 2003, or 18 years ago now, he captures both the spatial and economic paradox perfectly. He says, the attempt to imagine a spatial technical design solution to the conflict, one based on different paths of partition achieved by barriers, tunnels, and bridges, has thus reached this most extreme and dystopian logical conclusion and end result. This conclusion is too complex to offer security. It is too intrusive and aggressive to offer the appearance of a just solution, and it's too expensive to be economically viable in the long run. And he concludes with this obvious question: could the politics of borders and partitions be replaced by a more viable alternative based on inclusion, democracy, and human rights? I'll leave you there with that. And thanks. I'm sure there's loads of questions. I'm sorry I went on. Sorry it took longer than I thought. So Alice, are there questions there in the box that are we cut off?
No questions so far. If anyone wants to add a question to the chat box there,
Okay. Well, I'll just put this back. Sorry. Oh.
People could ask their questions. If you could unshare, Jim.
Yes. Why don't? Yeah. I'll unshare.
I've unshared you now.
Share.
If anyone wants to ask questions, either in the chat or just.
Have I unshared? Yeah. Good. Okay.
Yeah, or just unmute yourselves and ask any questions. From Daniel, would you have any books or articles you recommend? Well, you put your references up, will you, Jim, with this lecture?
I will. I have them on the. I just got through those at the end. I mean, I see it's already 6 minutes to 2. Sorry about that. That took so long. I can go through the references. Will
you send it to, when you finally get it together, Jim? Will you send your lecture to Alice and she can put it up on the current? And Miriam wants you to do a TEDx lecture. So there you go.
Well, thank you, Miriam. But my big ambition is to get Al Weissman over to Ireland. So
well, he's done. I've been at talks with him. He's done.
Yeah. But no, well, look, this has been recorded, so it's the start of that maybe. But it needs more work, Miriam. Thanks, Miriam.
Any other questions?
It's a bit long.
Any other questions? Would anyone like to unmute and ask a question?
Or comments?
Ronit says thanks.
Mine isn't really a question, but it's an interesting point, I guess. I was listening to an interview from the leader of the Green Party in Israel last summer, and she was making, she was talking about a statement I think she made in their parliament, which is about if the West Bank was occupied fully, it would be the end of Israel as we know it, due to the either two scenarios. One would be the international community could no longer ignore, if you'd have to either give, if you occupy it, you'd have to give the Palestinians a vote, which would mean it would be a majority Muslim country then, or if you don't give them a vote, then she was saying that the international community could no longer ignore Israel because it would be a proper apartheid state then at that point. It would be too hard to ignore. It was just an interesting one to point out, because she was the leader of the Green Party in Israel. It was kind of interesting note she was saying.
Thanks. Yeah, that's many people have made that observation, that that's Israel's dilemma in a way.
And Marcus asks, how can the Irish public create more pressure on our politicians and general awareness here?
Well, look, that's a really good question, and like the activists and solidarity groups, if you like, on behalf of Palestine, and they're kind of multivariate. There's various groups and individuals, and the closest thing I think we came to it was with the Occupied Territories Bill, with Senator Francis Black brought in terms of really getting at the government, and of course, sadly, a lot of Fianna Fáil TDs would have supported it, and all that was calling for was banning goods that were produced in the settlements. I mean, it wasn't exactly revolutionary, but it would have been a step, I think, in the right direction. And the Fine Gael wouldn't agree to it. So, and then the Greens capitulated, sadly. So it didn't form part of the program for government. So that's one thing. How else can we do? Just get involved in one of the activist groups. Join the Ireland Palestine Solidarity Campaign. If you're an academic, join Academics for Palestine. And we have, there's different layers of activity out there, both on an academic front and just in terms of solidarity activity. But it's very hard because governments just close you down all the time, and Ireland is regarded as one of the better countries in terms of Palestinian solidarity.